This is Phil at Magic Jesus, and I'm excited about today's special guest, the author of Caesar's Messiah, a remarkable book. It is a must-have Christ myth book. I'm willing to call it the best book in modern Christ mythicism, though there are parts of it I can't quite comprehend. Let's welcome Joseph Atwill.
Well, thank you for having me, Philip. Pleasure to be here.
There's so many things in your book. It's hard to know where to begin
Yeah,
with it.
It's a
Oh,
lump.
yes. Okay. The first thing I was hoping you could do is
Yeah.
kind of try to tell people what attitude they should take toward the Bible so that they can read it as you read it.
Well, unfortunately, to read it as I read it, you can't read it by itself. Um, you need to have the perspective of it possibly being typologic literature. And that means that the stories of Jesus are not historical, but are a kind of fiction, a genre that I describe as typology. So, in other words, the stories in the New Testament, the stories about Jesus's life, are based on other stories in other works of literature. And I give an example of just a crystal clear um, way in which the understanding of the authors of the New Testament can be had, which occurs at the very beginning of the book, where I show that all of the pre-ministry events of Jesus were developed out of the story of Moses. They're all, the stories seem like the author's writing history about Jesus's pre-ministry life, but actually, and I'd be happy to go through the list, though it's long, and any reader can or listener to us can easily do this themselves. That the whole pre-ministry was based out of the story of Exodus, and there's a purpose for it. If you want to understand, well, why did the author construct his story of Jesus in this way? He's making the point using typology that Jesus is linked to Moses, that Moses is basically the first savior, and Jesus will be a subsequent savior. And you can tell that God has ordained Jesus's life and power because he is representing Moses in all of these events in his early life. So I would say in terms of trying to answer your question, it's simply that you need to have a perspective of that the genre of literature is not defined at the beginning of the book. This is something that readers have to discern, through careful reading, and to just because it's a new understanding of this literature. It's best to really have a little bit of understanding about the genre, and so that's why, as I wrote Caesar's Messiah, I start out with trying to explain that the pre-ministry of Jesus typology, which is very simple and easy to understand and is not controversial. Scholars have accepted this as the correct understanding of the literature for 100 years. So and that would be what I would suggest, is that to start out just trying to understand the typology in the New Testament, and to do that you just look at the Jesus Moses typology that's given in Matthew.
You have also mentioned that we need some sense of parody, that we need some sense of sarcasm and even sardonic humor in
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is, again, once you kind of got typology as a genre, then you sort of have to go into a plausible interpretive framework as to why the authors of this literature would be linking into the Roman war. And a lot of the connections are actually, well, black humor, sardonic would be a good word. I mean, just to start off the ministry, Jesus says, if you follow me, you will become fishers of men, to his disciples. And if you're following the typology, which is sequential, you'll come at the beginning of the military campaign of Titus Flavius to the same location. Location is one of the elements that's used to construct the typological linkage. You come at the correct time in the sequence, at the beginning of Titus's campaign. You come to the same location that Jesus made his fishing for men prediction, and then you have the historical connection of the Jews being in their fishing boats, and then Titus going out, sinking the boats, and then catching them like fish, fishing for men. Now, the connection hasn't really been noticed by scholars, even though it's very straightforward, and both the sequence, the position in the two campaigns of Titus and Jesus, and also the location are self-evident. But you can't really see the connection if you aren't open to a kind of black humor. You see, my point is that it's you need to have that perspective be something that you're scanning for. The way to kind of understand the Jesus Titus typology is not really to start with the complicated or sardonically humorous parallels. It's really best to just look at the historical events that are used as part of the sequence. You go to encircling Jerusalem with a wall, raising of the temple, the abomination of desolation, things that are actually historical events that are recorded by Josephus, and then looking at how they are, the sequence that they're occurring in. And then I would say the next thing is just go to the obvious parallels that has been, talked about by other scholars. There's been, oh my gee whiz, there's like 10 or 15 of the parallels that I point out have been analyzed individually by scholars who came before me. What they didn't recognize is that they are in a sequence, and that the collection of all of these parallels would have some understanding. Once you have the sequence understood, then you go, for example, like the triumphant entrance, which is an absolutely absurd and ribald comic kind of exposition. And it'll make perfect sense, but only when you get to the point where you're reading with the understanding that the typological system is sequential and it has been demonstrated. When you get there, you can see, well, there's no other way to look at this, because all of the little ways that the passages are linked, and in the location, the physical location, and the location in the sequence. So there has to be this kind of connection, but it can only really be just very, very black. And I would just say it's kind of like sophomoric. The humor in the Gospels is vulgar, and it's sophomoric. It's basically ridiculing. I mean, I would say it's mocking the people who believe in religion in general. I think the people who put out this literature are very, see themselves as kind of, high class intellectuals, and not succumbing to, kind of the religion for the weak minded, So anyway, so that's the thing. I mean, I'm sorry to bring this out, because believe me, I've taken grief for pointing these things out, but I do believe the analysis is correct. And man, the Gospels have a lot of really, really black and sardonic humor. And it's sad in a way, because, the words of Jesus has always been held out as an example of sort of a higher level of human consciousness, and that he's something that we can aspire and use as a guidepost in our development of moral structures. But man, I'm sorry, it's actually the reverse.
Right. But if people carefully follow the progression, the sequence of events, then they are able to match the Bible to Josephus,
Yes,
is
that's
what you're
exactly correct. Yes.
okay, because that's excellent. Because if you have any history of the Jews coming out here, it seems to be filtered through Josephus.
Yeah, it's the only. I think all of the other literature was destroyed. I mean, bear in mind the Dead Sea Scrolls are a kind of version of the history of the era, but they were found buried, in pots, in caves, have been sealed over. Obviously, the Romans were going to destroy all, contravening literature. They weren't going to permit anything that would contradict the version of history that they were going to put out for this, this character, Jesus Christ.
And I believe you have postulated something of a Christian school for authors, however informal, to account for the possibility that we have a number of Josephine authors.
Yeah, I mean, once you kind of, try to create the history of our literature using the analysis that I put out in Caesar's Messiah. I mean, I know this is self-serving and grandiose, but it's just how I look at the world. And I think once you do this, you really understand, how clear and accurate your comment is. I mean, there had to have been teams of people. This isn't the work of one individual. So there would have been, it would have been a project that Rome, the imperial family, would have taken very seriously, and they would have had their best men on the project to bring it out. And it didn't really stop just with the Flavians. I mean, there's examples of, as you go forward, certainly not just of Titus and Vespasian, but also of Domitian. I write about that in the book I called Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. But even beyond that, you can see Trajan. And then when you get to Constantine, and he's putting out the version that purportedly we have now, I mean, even he could have been twiddling with the thing. He certainly was aware of the Flavian typology, and he might have been putting things in there. So there's a lot to discover inside the Gospels and the New Testament in general that I was aware of a lot of it, at least as questions, but would imagine that in the future there'll be people who want to take it on and see if they can really decode the entire book.
That's fascinating. Some authors have suggested Luke, for instance, is copying Josephus, but you say Josephus is copying the Bible.
The thing is, once the character Jesus is shown as typologic fiction, there really isn't any more reason to believe in the historicity of Luke, Matthew, Mark, or even Josephus. These are just nom de plumes that are used mainly for the purpose of creating a plausible historical structure for their literature. I mean, that's so I don't really, like I think the synoptic problem is basically the problem is in the minds of the people who think there's a problem. I mean, it's a lot easier than trying to posit that there's all this, individual uh, kind of gospels which reflect a different school or a different individual author. I mean, it's just so much easier to just say, forget all that. There'll never be a resolution to the synoptic problem because it doesn't really exist. What you're looking at is first century word processing, where they have the fictional names that they've come up for the different books. The authors have created them. These are teams that are aware of one another's work. They're unifying them. And so when you have verbatim passages going back and forth, you just are looking at, what I would call first century word processing. They're just copying text. But moreover, the different perspectives, which are legitimate. I mean, I think that, you can say, well, this one's a little more Hebraic, this one seems to be more Greek. I mean, it's probably reflecting, exactly that perspective. It's just that's coming out of the Flavian court, that they would have different ways of manipulating the literature, probably for different groups they wanted to send out the copies to, or for who knows what reason. They just they wanted to hide the typology. So you have a lot of different authors, and they reflect. As I said, they reflect all the imperial court would have had control over the literature from the end of the first century all the way to Constantine. So I mean, I think there's many people, many hands inside of it. I don't try to explain those elements, those questions. Those things I think are interesting, and I hope maybe scholars in the future will look at those problems through the lens of my analysis. But Philip, all I really try to do is just show the basic typologic connection. I mean, once that's established, once people understand that that's why the Gospels were written, and this is how it works, then the questions that have been really central to New Testament scholarship become less important. In fact, in my mind, they're just uninteresting.
Okay, it seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you have something of two Christ. You have the militaristic prince or son of the king who is a warrior, and then you have his prophet,
Yeah,
Jesus, on the other hand.
yeah, exactly. I mean, in the Gospels, you have um, Jesus and Eleazar, and Eleazar would have been the name of the militaristic and legitimate Christ. I mean, remember, there is a capture on the Mount of Olives, and then the individual is taken. And in my analysis, I show that he's the one who is then crucified in a group of three, and then he amazingly survives the crucifixion. I mean, he's just this capture of Eleazar is in the Mount of Olives is the basis for the story of the crucifixion in Jesus. But it means that you have in Josephus, you have Titus, who is the recipient of the most of the Jesus typology, but you also have the character Eleazar, who I think would be the militaristic Messiah. There are coins from the first rebellion, the 66-73 rebellion, which have Eleazar the priest stamped on them. And I think he was a real individual, historical individual. He would have been militaristic. I mean, he would have plugged into the religious perspective you find, for example, in the War Scrolls, right? In the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are xenophobic and highly militaristic. And I mean, it was a religious struggle. I mean, the Josephus recorded that. He points out that what propelled the Jews to rebel was their belief in a Messiah. And so the Romans are transmogrifying this perspective. I mean, they are shaping the historical characters into characters that are in a religion that can abide inside the Roman Empire. So you have the history, you have the Gospels, and then you have the authors who are making the connections both back to the story of Exodus in many cases, but also into history, into war. They're trying to end up with a religion that is believable as an extension of the messianic religion that rebelled, right? So they would have some of the aspects of it, so that people who are familiar with of that religious perspective would be comfortable. And then, of course, they plug in their typology, which is just creating legacy for themselves, basically. However, you have to get through the typology and these connections to be able to see, what went on in history.
All right. Are the Christians perhaps actually very rational, skeptical people that are trying to share with their higher initiates that you should be a skeptical sort of scientific thinker?
It's interesting. I mean, I really wouldn't be able to add much to that idea. You have the mockery of the original Christians that the Romans are doing. And then you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I think are in fact the literature of the first century Messianic movement.
That is,
And as to what their kind of position is vis-a-vis
very helpful.
rationale, it's not clear to me. I really wouldn't know. I think certainly the position of the Messianic movement of Palestine, the real one, was rational. I mean, the Romans were occupying and then attempting to enslave and I'm sure to get rid of their religion. And so the idea of rebellion in that sense is rational. But what really is inside, you see, one problem is, I mean, what are we really left with in terms of primary documents? We've got Josephus, but we know that comes right out of the Flavian court, so you have to throw that out the window. And then they had the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the things are tortured. You don't really know what fraction of the whole literature that represents, or even what point of time in the development of the religion they're coming from. So unfortunately, in terms of documentation, I mean, basically it's zero. We just don't have much.
Right.
I mean, that's what people, say I kind of ruined the history of the first century. I go, yeah, it's true, but you're better off trying to make sense out of the first century using the Flavian typology, because at least that, with their humor, with their mockery, I mean, you get a kind of perspective that's real anyway. You see what I mean? It's like, at least start there and then try to work out using, what few historical details we have.
Okay. Now, it seems to me also that Christianity rests on a small number of historical reporters who are largely talking over everyone's heads. And this is Josephus, Philo, Tacitus, Suetonius. If you realize that these accounts, that you really don't know who the authors are,
Yeah.
then they're able to plant this religion in a historical frame.
Oh, well said, Philip. I mean, here's the thing. All of those guys, Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio, Josephus, what do they have in common? What they have in common is they're Flavian court historians. So that would be the kind of starting point for understanding, their perspective of history.
Right, but they remind me of the CIA or something. If they tell
Yeah.
you anything, they're probably lying.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it's like in Philo. I mean, remember Philo, his brother is the Albarchs of Egypt, right? Whose son is Tiberius. Tiberius is the Flavian general against the Jews in Jerusalem during the siege. So Philo is as much of a Flavian insider as imaginable, in my opinion. Tiberius, his nephew, was the very first person to stand for Vespasian as emperor when he was going through the struggle with the Julio-Claudians. He stood, he said, yeah, we're going to go with Vespasian. And he referred to him as a human god. Well, okay, what kind of a Jewish individual is this? I mean, you get an asterisk in my mind in terms of the legitimacy of their religious claims. I mean, I think of Philo as just another one of the guys who are wired into the Flavian court and on the payroll.
Right. He seems like the most open-minded Jewish person that's ever been encountered or something.
Well, I mean, if you look at Philo and then you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you go, well, it's impossible. How could they possibly be sharing the same religion? Because Philo is completely irrational, whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, they are. I mean, it is a fundamental and very, I would say, in just being honest, it's a folkloric, xenophobic kind of position. Philo, on the other hand, is the most Socratic individual imaginable. He's just like he's intellectual almost to the point of being ridiculous. He just knows everything. He studied everything, and he's just terribly objective about it. I mean, he seems almost inhuman to me. But I mean, he is reason personified, whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls are, I mean, they are, theological xenophobia.
Just fascinating. Mentioned in an interview with Rodef Emmett that Romans had locked the Hebrew teachings up and probably had entirely destroyed them otherwise, whereas historians are just claiming that the stuff rotted away, that why we don't have Jewish literature.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, there was actually a whole kind of historical position that the Jews in the first century were illiterate because there was no literature at all. They thought, well, they'd forgotten how to write. They had rough times in terms of the colonialization, and education went out the window, and that's why there was no literature. They found the scrolls, which, just make the case that they do, which just exposes the group who wrote them as, having this really, as I said, theological xenophobia, very, very kind of, I don't want to use the word primitive, but it's just very emotional kind of theology. And you can easily understand where it comes from, because they've been colonized, so it's not a position where you're going to get, a lot of objective kind of considerations of what is reason and what is divine. So, that's what we have. I think that the second phase of this was, okay, so first they destroyed the religion. They just mechanically tried to kill everyone who was, or enslave anyone who had during the wars. But then they also created rabbinical Judaism. I mean, rabbinical Judaism, all of the changes that occur between, kind of the historically understandable Judaism and then what rabbinical Judaism puts out, are obviously, contrived, and are trying to fit the religion into the Roman Empire so that it can exist without this constant rebellion. And if you'll notice that in the Talmud, Rabbi Zakkai, who was really the founder of rabbinical Judaism, I mean, he goes through the same homage to Vespasian that Josephus does. They have this whole story in the Talmud where Zakkai, meets Vespasian, and he says, all of these prophecies in our text that people think are about a Jewish Messiah, they're wrong. They're about you, Vespasian. You are the Jewish Messiah. So this was the beginning of rabbinical Judaism. And frankly, doesn't look good to me. It looks like the Romans pretty much put that religion in a box.
Right. Well, they kind of need someone to blame anyway as a people, and if they have no one else, they will blame themselves, is what it seems like. The
Sure.
religious believers. Okay, I can't tell that any part of the Bible is really not allegory.
No, neither can I. I mean, it's all allegory, of course. I mean, the typology actually clarifies it as allegory rather than history. I would say a really good, if people want to get into that question about the extent that it's allegory, I would start out by looking at the famous Cannibal Mary passage in Josephus. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yes. Oh,
And
yes.
then comparing that to the Last Supper. And you can see how they will, each story informs the other of allegorical principles and construction, all of the names of the individuals and the, and the cannibalism that's going on and the meaning of it, because the passage in Josephus is extraordinary in as an allegory and its complexity and this isn't sort of my understanding. I mean there are scholars that have developed whole books on the Cannibal Mary passage showing its allegory, how Josephus is actually writing a story that is showing the kind of divine retribution that God is bringing to the Jews for their rebellion, right? And then when you juxtapose the stories, the cannibals, the human, as I call them, the son of Mary, who's the human Passover lamb, because these are the concepts that are the same in both of the stories, the ones in the Gospel and the one in Josephus. You are able to see both of them in a clearer light, and the idea of what the allegorical meaning of both of them, which again it gets into the dark and sardonic humor, it comes out really clearly, but you can't see it or really understand the allegory without the typologic juxtaposition. So you
That's
can see,
true. That's
it's
true.
really, it's really complicated literature. It's one of the reasons why it hasn't really ever. I think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been seen, is that it's just not a kind of literary genre that New Testament scholars are really trained in. I wasn't trained in it. I just sort of developed it just bit by bit as I went through trying to understand the parallels I was seeing and then trying to understand the sequence. When I got to the point, you want to know how I would begin to understand the allegorical and the connections, is I found the parallels. Some of them had never been noticed before, and I started looking at them as a hobby. But then I noticed that they were occurring in the same sequence in both in Josephus and the Gospel. So you had this one long sequence through the adult ministry of Jesus, that all of these parallels that have been deliberately created. And that was the perspective I brought to the analysis. I said, well, what are they trying to say with this deliberately constructed parallel sequence? And so that's kind of how I got to develop sort of like how you can see the as you mentioned, the allegoric structure, that goes through the entire New Testament. And all I can say is your intuition, if you had developed that, just on your own, that's very good analytic achievement, because so few people get there, where they're actually, like I really want to look at this literature as allegory. It's because we've been trained so much in the history. We've been trained to look at it as history, and that just got into our worldview and understanding of everything. And once it was fixed, it's just hard for the human mind to abandon that and go into a whole new, kind of analytic approach.
Okay, well, it sounds pretty clear to me that your detractor, Richard Carrier, for instance, is simply reading a Bible that is too simplistic. He's taking too simplistic an approach, but we will come back. All right, so let me get us back to Magdalene, Mary Magdalene. Now, that was one thing I hadn't noticed. I'm studying you in audio, which is unfortunate. And I had somehow missed the part that you actually have multiple Mary Magdalenes.
Yeah, I mean, the name means, Mary from Migdal, and you have all of the Marys within the Gospels. It's something of a mystery why there's so many, and I just point out that the name means rebellious female, and since the Gospels are a allegoric representation of the follies of the Jewish rebellion, that explains the many Marys, and so Mary from Migdal is just one of the many Marys. They're all characterizations of just the female members of the Jewish rebellious Messianic sect.
Right. Now, you say that what Mary is eating, the child that she is eating, is the roasted sacrifice of the house of Hyssop.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
Beth Azab, I think, is the connection point there.
Well, it's it's allegorical. It is relating to the creation of the original Passover lamb. So, in other words, the story in Josephus is a way of it is linking into the complicated human Passover lamb metaphor in the Gospels. But that is the basis for the what's going on in the story of Josephus. It is part of this whole interrelated allegory, typologic allegory, in which the human Passover lamb of the new covenant is being set up as a parallel to the human Passover lamb of the first covenant. So that here you have this blasphemous, and when you understand it, it's a kind of a desecration of the first covenant, right?
Right.
It's a mockery of it. So the way they set it up in Josephus, in the story about the human Passover lamb, I mean, the way that it is a human Passover lamb is that they have elements of the first Passover lamb that are subtly inserted into the story. One of them is that the character who is being eaten is from the house of Hyssop, and I would say that within the juxtaposition of all of these elements, it's pretty clear that this is relating to the use of hyssop to mark the houses of the Jews that were going to be passed over in the first Passover story, the sacrifice for the Passover. So in that story, the Jews were marked who were going to survive. The angel came and marked these individuals' houses, but then they had the Passover lamb in a certain way, and there are instructions as to how to do it. It had to be roasted. So this character in Josephus is described as being roasted. So he's in theme with the Passover lamb imagery. And then in the Gospels, you have Jesus touched with hyssop, right? They they mark him with hyssop when he's on the cross, just to link into the first Passover story. But then they don't break his bones, right? Because that's one of the other instructions that God gave for the eating of the Passover lamb. And so
Right. In fact, it seems to me they're talking about the way the scapegoat's bones could be broken if it were thrown off a cliff, as was believed by many.
exactly, yeah. So they're juxtaposing it. So this
Right.
is the divine, introduction into the new covenant, right?
Have you ever connected hyssop, which is Esau in Hebrew, to Esau or Esau, the brother
No,
of
but
Jacob?
I kind of no, I know exactly the linkage that you're suggesting, and no, I've never done that analysis. I'm aware of it. It's just one of those things that
Well,
because
you got red-haired Esau, and the
yeah,
the hyssop is a red-haired plant,
I would love,
arguably.
I'll tell you, if you are some perky listener, does that analysis, I'd love to see it.
Okay.
I have like a whole list of things that if I ever have a surplus of mental energy, I want to get around to. But the problem is, it isn't sort of the list of things to do. It's the level of mental energy. I'm 74 now, and so it's pretty easy to find ways to avoid doing stuff like that. But I know exactly what you're talking about. I'd love to see that analysis.
And even Moses, with Jesus, Moses is sacrificed right at the boundary of Israel. He reaches the promised land, puts one toe in the water, and he's dead.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, so you have this previous background of a chosen one of God, and that often doesn't work out the way they think it's going to work out. It's the myth reverses our expectations.
Sure it does. And you get the political perspective of the authors. It comes through. I don't really understand the Moses story particularly. I actually have a kind of a digression. I mean, I wonder about the Moses stories in general, what they're actually reflecting, because they seem so sort of tangential and separated from like the Isaiah and Daniel and things like that. Like, where do they come from? And I have a suspicion, and this is just, I know I'll be pillared for even mentioning this, but I think actually where the Moses stories come from, I think they may have been reflecting, actual history in Israel, wherever that might have been for the the authors of the story. But where they come into play is that when you had Hannibal, the Carthaginian, who I think it's a Semitic relations to the people in Israel, that when you had Hannibal driven out of Italy, he headed east and ends up someplace in Syria, where I guess they claim he's killed. But then the Hasmoneans emerge only like 40 years later, and I am betting that the Hasmoneans are actually kind of the military descendants of Hannibal, and they were the ones who brought them the Moses story. And then they also, the Talmud then gets patched together of with other religious stories, but and that's why even like the political sort of visions that the stories have seems strange and not related. And I would love to see like a kind of a literary deconstruction of the Old Testament, just based on what can be determined through just pure literary analysis. But again, it's sort of like first century Judea and trying to get history out of my analysis. Philip, it's really at the end just a fool's errand, because we don't have the documents. Everything was destroyed. They razed Carthage. They destroyed all of the Hebraic literature in the first century. And then they carefully controlled what even ends up with being Christian literature. I mean, look, for example, at the Nag Hammadi material, right? How different that is from the Gospels that Constantine put out. Well, the only reason we know about those things is, again, they were hidden in pots and buried. So this shows that the Romans were just getting rid of all of the history and religious literature that they thought could in any way be a historical problem for the story that they were presenting. And the problem is, the real problem is they succeeded. So all we're left with is, just bits and pieces that we can kind of tease together, but without any great deal of precision. And the Gospels. I mean, I think at this point, I think we can just throw Josephus out the window. I think that whole thing is, it's basically just it was constructed. Certainly, there are historical events in it, but who knows what's real, what isn't. And I mean, and with my analysis, you can go to Philo and you go, what's real, what's propaganda? You see what I mean? I mean, once you take the position that you're dealing with propaganda, where does it end? It's just so hard to know.
Right. You seem to have an Alexander myth going on in there as well, with the root Mandragoras and this place called Baris.
Yeah.
And the plant is named for the place, of course, and all of this.
Well, that's just in Josephus. That is just completely contained within the Josephian literature. That isn't in the theological literature of the Gospels, where you would more likely see this kind of a religious allegory, pop up. I mean, Josephus is presenting that bit of madness as history. That there's this root, and the Jews cut it down, and it just has all these magical properties. I mean, again, it's I think that your approach is where you're looking at literature as metaphor, and you're
Yes.
linking the metaphorical. I hate to say it. I know, again, I'll be pillored for this. I think you're on to a better approach to understanding history than the people who are taking it with a straight face and the literature as history, and then just try to use that as a platform. I think we're a lot better off using the approach you're taking, and then trying to see what history looks like when we understand the metaphors.
Right. Okay. Well, see, I'm seeing Mandragoras as the Scamandros. It is, and that's just a form of the name Alexander. Now, Alexander was a god man. Okay, he was believed by many to be a god as well, just as you're saying you could do with Caesar. And
Sure.
he's a mandragon. It is the mandrakos plant that they're discussing there, the mandrake. And this is like the mandragon, and there's all kinds of superstitions about this plant, that it just has enormous power to drive off demons and
Yeah,
that sort
well,
of.
that analogy courses through all of Josephus, where that root actually ends up back in the Flavian court. I mean, I don't know if you've ever followed the whole thing, but they actually get the root back to the Flavian court, and then that's the only time, I think, in Josephus they actually record the Flavian Caesars all being in one room together. You got Domitian, Titus, and Vespasian, and they got Jewish rebels, and they use the root to basically exorcise the demons out of the Jewish rebel. I mean, it's just a ludicrous and fantastic and obviously politically driven metaphor. And it goes throughout. It's Josephus has it all over the place. All this chain of the story goes through many different chapters and things. You got to really puzzle through it to get to the end, but it ends up with this just fantastic situation where they're using the root, which is representation of Jesus, their version of the vegetative messianic metaphor in Judaic literature, right? The root
Right.
is
So
branch.
is he the branch as well? I mean, it's a little confusing. But you talk about root and branch allegories.
Yeah, and it ends up with the final piece of that is where the Flavians are all sitting there with a Jewish rebel who is rebelling against the Roman Empire because he has demonic spirit inside him, and then they stick the root. If I recall right, they stick the root into his nose and pull the.
Yeah.
I'm serious, and then they pull the devil out. It's just like some kind of horror movie from Exorcism, and then the devil leaves. I mean, it's an insane story, and as history makes absolutely no sense. It's sitting right in the middle of Josephus. Scholars never talk about it, because you know why? Because it's an obvious reflection of the idea that the Flavians are using their character Jesus to subdue the devil inside the Jewish rebels. I mean, it's just, to me, the metaphor is just
Right.
transparent. So they don't want to talk about it. So
Right. Well, there. Another thing is I've noticed Carrier's OHJ, when he got to Rufus and Alexander, he decided it's Musonius Rufus and Alexander the Great as far as he knows. But he's forgetting that Paris Alexander in Homer brought ruin upon his city. His sister Cassandra, which is Alexandra, she forecasts. She foretells the ruin of the city. Don't let that horse into the city, she says. Nobody listens to her. Jesus is in the same role, and he's saying that the destroyer is coming, but they think he's coming back. They think Jesus himself is the one coming back to save them or something.
yeah, I mean, but of course their understanding is incoherent, because Jesus is describing the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right.
And so your approach is completely correct, that you know, and I'm not familiar with you know, that piece of mythology, but I can follow your logic, and yeah, Cassandra is correct. The destroyer is coming, and you know, there is a whole world of symbolism connected with Alexander, and you know, and it is inside of Josephus, and it's inside of the Gospels, and I do not understand it. It's on my bucket list of you know, things to do when I have surplus energy.
Okay, well, that's excellent. So they're essentially trying to tame in. It's something like they're trying to put a branch in that is tamed, and
Yeah,
then tame the Jerusalemites as another branch of the Roman Empire.
exactly. Well said. That's exactly right. That's what they want to do. They want to like graft onto the messianic um, vine, the branch, the root, you know, root of Jesse, branch of David. They want to graft on using Roman logic and science, just like they do with a wild plant, a Messiah that's going to plug into the Roman Empire, so the rebellions will stop. And that's what the Gospels, as a political piece of literature, are intended to do. The Gospels are funny in that, you know, you have the political you know, the political purpose, which is the religion, to tame down Messianic Judaism, which is militaristic, and to make it something that can fit into the Roman Empire. So that's the long-term kind of political purpose. But then you have all this bizarre typology that they've put in, and that's just vanity. So you have this element of vanity which contorts the, you know, the literature. It really makes it so hard to understand. I mean, why exactly are these stories, you know, being used as the basis for metaphor? Well, it's because it was how they were able to keep the two stories consistent in locations, and kind of consistent in terms of metaphor. But the whole purpose here, Philip, is that they want to get to the end of the Gospels, and Jesus talks about the Son of Man who's going to come in 40 years, and he's going to do all these things. He's going to raise the temple and encircle the city with the wall. At least those are events that are going to be associated with his coming. And they want the clear-minded kind of individual in the future to read this and realize that really Jesus is predicting the Flavian Caesar. I mean, that's just the whole purpose of all the typology, the whole purpose of the story of the Gospels. I mean, here's this world historical piece of literature, and all it really is just a vanity piece for these particular Caesars, so they could say, hey, we the Jews wouldn't worship us, so we just did it without their knowing it. You know, we just fooled them.
Well, it seems an odd juxtaposition to me that Josephus becomes the prophet of Vespasian, and then it would seem to me that Jesus becomes the prophet of Titus.
Yeah,
Then,
well, it's just ridiculous. I mean, again, it's just how many people can get their hands in this literature and work out kind of ways to create legacy for themselves. You know, I mean, it was These are, I guess these were very sort of sophisticated people. They kind of liked literary puzzles. They certainly were vainglorious and wanted the literature to be, kind of you know, like a reflection of their idea of divinity. I mean, now, if you drive around Rome today, you'll see that almost all of the structures that are, still there from, the imperial era, um, are monuments to the divinity of Caesars. I mean, look at the Arch of Titus, for God's sakes. It actually has God the Father Vespasian, the Son of God Titus, is carved right into the stone, and it's, of course, on the relief of the arch are events from the Roman Jewish War that Jesus predicted, right? The destruction of the temple. So it's, you know the the purpose of the literature is clarified at that moment, because you can see that really the Gospels are just a literary version of the Arch of Titus.
Just fascinating. I wonder about Pontius Pilate. And it seems to me that he is just very conveniently located, and that we maybe know too much about him, because we know way more about him than any actual governor of
Oh yeah,
of a province.
yeah. Josephus has a whole kind of like story about Pontius Pilate, and then in the middle of that, he inserts the testimonium, which some scholars think is fictional, but was definitely inserted right there in the middle of the Pontius Pilate stories. And I mean, this goes to the point of we've lost our understanding of first century history. I mean, the
Right. Well,
gospel, we just don't have any. In fact, I'll even back up and say we've even lost the chronology, because you look at the ministry of Jesus, concluding at 33, and then you look at the day that the Romans took over control of Israel was 73, and on Passover is 33, Passover 73. Well, where did that 40 years come from? Well, they're mirroring the first, the structure of the first covenant, where you had the
right. The
40 years.
40
Yeah,
years in the
yeah,
wilderness.
yeah.
Right.
But my point is, you can't get to 33 by some miraculous method. You have to just back calculate. So whatever 73 was to them, that then became also 33. They just minused 40 from it, and they got 33. But what's worse, and this really is kind of a brain puzzler, is that
Right.
even 70 is out the window, because 70 is just the midpoint of a week. See, they're trying to set up the week of Daniel. So you have the abomination of desolation, which Daniel predicted and is predicted in the Gospels, and then Josephus records is actually coming to pass during the war. Now, that has to be 3.5 years from the end. So, or roughly, so that's why they positioned what we call 70 relating to the fall of Masada 3.5 years from that, and then began the ministry of Jesus at 30, concluding it at 33. But you can see that all of these dates are just back calculated using the theological, kind of template, and they're all ahistorical. I mean, I'm sorry, the whole first century is just out the window in terms of our chronologic understanding of it. So there it is.
Right. Well, another thing that gets me about the Pontius story is that the New Testament employs the Bacchae by Euripides, and it steals a little bit from that in Acts. And what you have there is vine god Dionysus
Yeah,
opposite the
yeah.
city ruler Pentheus. Now in Jerusalem, we're supposed to believe there was the vine god Jesus opposite Pontius. Okay, and I find that too unlikely. I don't think that history is copying mythology.
No, I agree. I happen to be aware of that. I mean, I haven't developed it to the extent you have, but I was aware of that. And yeah, I mean, you can see that, you know, they don't really care about history. They're constructing um, typologic fiction, and they just use elements from history in any way they want. I mean, who's to say no? Who's to say it's incorrect?
Exactly. That's what I get. The Bible scholars keep saying, "Oh, well, they're doing it this way. They have this goal, and they don't have it in mind that these people are just allegorists." And
Exactly. And, that's the thing. Is that you can imagine how it's almost kind of crazy making. I'll have discussions with New Testament scholars, and they'll try to contradict my work using historical characters or events which are completely contradicted by my work.
right, they're absurd characters, is
And they
what they.
become absurd, right? Exactly. And so I go, well, I mean, there really isn't a lot to discuss here. I mean, if you want to just have that version of history and then try to link things, I can see that my analysis will, not fit well into it. Understand that. God bless you. In terms of my understanding your position, I mean, I just think you're thick as a brick. You're just missing all of the, kind of metaphorical connections, which are obvious and in many cases occurring in sequence. And we can't really discuss it. It's because we're just taking positions that are too, they're too far apart in terms of their understanding of the world, and they're using in the case of the New Testament scholars that would debate this way, they're using what they think, it's circular logic. They're using their conclusion as a premise, that they conclude that this is a real history, so therefore they can use it to contradict, analysis that shows that it's not real history. Well, I'm sorry. I mean,
Right.
look. I mean, I just, am just completely comfortable with my position because it's based on a sequence and on connections which have been seen by a great many other scholars. So I can't be accused of parallelmania because so many people have
Right.
seen some of these things, and many of them are just actual historical events, right? That it's the only thing that I'm really bringing. The main thing I'm bringing is going, look, guys, this is all occurring in the sequence in both the Gospels and Josephus, and that cannot be circumstance. So that means that these works are wired together. They're wired together. And if they are, the history shows that the religion is false, and the religion shows that the history is false. So what we are left with is just the kind of analysis we're able to do, when we kind of typologically construct the meaning of the two literatures. But it's never going to take us to some kind of certitude about, well, the history is this exactly or that exactly or this, we just can't get there. The Romans engaged in propaganda. What they left us, the Gospels, the works of Josephus, the Tacitus, I know it is presented as history, but man, you have to always be aware that you need to put the lens of it possibly being propaganda on top of this stuff, because they had no reason to try to give posterity a clear understanding of history. They had every reason to create propaganda that would help them maintain their power.
Right. Well, now I've faced a lot of flack from the so-called atheist community. I mean, I'm an atheist, but whether I'm in the community or not doesn't matter to me. Okay. Because I find the people that helped create Richard Carrier and give him the stature that he has, they call themselves free thinkers, but they're really not. They're falling into the same allegorical trap that the Christians are. And all they do, they think quoting Carrier is proving something. So I've taken a lot of grief because I've said, I hate to tell you all, Carrier is wrong, Atwill is right. And Carrier simply cannot read the Bible the right way, because you
No,
can't
I
you
mean,
can't just read the Bible. You have to read everything else.
right, exactly. And sad to say, but I really don't know what Carrier's training was, but I just, in a general sense, the more you're trained in classic New Testament scholarship, the less able you are to see, metaphor, and to see what has been studied as history as allegorical. That's just the nature of the human mind. I wrote a response to Carrier's criticism called Richard Carrier, the PhD who drowned at Gadara. And I mean, I showed that. Like we had, Carrier and I have had like, dozens of exchanges. I mean, he's really a bizarre character. I won't go into personalities, but anyway, it's a waste of time interacting with him. But at one point, he was saying that my analysis of the kind of allegory of the Battle of Gadara would be impossible because pigs couldn't travel from the town of Gadara to the Sea of Galilee. He said they just couldn't do it. And I wrote back, I said, well, first of all, you're just mechanically wrong. I mean, they could cover the distance in 30 minutes. It's not a big deal. But moreover, I go, Richard, how exactly do you know the range of demonized pigs? I mean, once the spirit of the demon has got in them, I mean, their range has been increased, So, but you see, that's just a kind of a comical example of trying to apply, sort of the principles of reality to allegory. You're just wasting your time. And if readers want to stay there with that kind of understanding, I don't care. Let them have that understanding. I've developed, an allegorical and typologic understanding of the literature, and frankly, I know I'm right. But if someone wants to stay there with the idea that we know how fast pigs can run or how far it is, I mean, okay, right. But remember, guys, they're demonized.
Right.
You can't apply, 4-H, kind of understanding of pig training to demonize pigs, because these are a special class of pigs. And so this is, that's an example of New Testament scholarship. Really didn't achieve a lot. It was interesting, Carrier never read my book. I couldn't get him to read it, but he just,
I know, isn't that terrible?
It's a bizarre. I didn't want to go. It's just wasting. It's a waste of time. But I sent my analysis. The guy who actually kind of got it going was Robert Eisenman, and I can't recall. I had put out a little tiny analysis, a pamphlet, and I think someone showed it to him, and somehow we got in contact, and he liked it. He thought this is really kind of original and interesting. He says, makes sense. And so he arranged to, I sent it to Harold Ellens. And Ellens was the head of the Society for Biblical Literature. And I wanted him to do a peer review thing and put it in his magazine, but couldn't get that done because I'm not an academic. And there are hundreds of academics trying to, get peer review because it's a big deal to them, and it means nothing. I mean, nothing to me. But what Ellens did is he did all of the, he did all of the, kind of errata. He showed little errors in my Greek understanding, which is not good and are not strong. And so he's a really, powerful New Testament scholar. In fact, he was the technical referee of the Society for Biblical Literature. But because he read the literature, even though he was a Christian, which is hard to imagine, he actually came to the point of saying, this is a very legitimate way of understanding it. I mean, can you imagine that? Head of Society of Biblical Literature and a Christian. I think he was a minister. He's passed away, but he wrote a beautiful blurb, which is on the, on my book. And I don't think he ever got to the point where he agreed. He obviously not. I think he stayed a Christian to the end. But he said, this is a completely original and legitimate way of understanding it. And he said, this is just amazing that you can actually look at this literature and come up to the conclusions you've done. But, you can also just use the circular logic of, no, I'm believing in the history, and the history contradicts the metaphor. But this is obviously bass-ackward, right? I mean, the gospel is religious literature. There's metaphor and theologic structure all throughout it. You have to look at what is posited as history as at least having the potential for being part of the genre, part of the metaphorical genre. So, the atheist community that, sees Jesus as, some kind of historical character or mythologic character that is constructed in some strange way. Just to digress,
it's the historical agenda that you keep fighting against.
Exactly. And also just bad thinking. I mean, one thing that mythicists see, I have this idea, it's top-down literature. This doesn't come bubbling up from, congregations that we don't have any evidence of. It's just top-down literature, and that's the right way to understand it. They wanted to create this literature, and they created Jesus, and that's why we got the Gospels.
Okay, so
That'd be great, but I mean, I really enjoy this. Love to do it, and happy to do as many more as you know you can stomach.
well, I am going to be in your book.
Okay, there you go.
All
There you
right.
go. All right,
Well, I want to
let's
thank you
do it.
very much, Joseph Atwill.
No, my pleasure. What a really fun conversation for me. Really appreciate it, and appreciate your questions, and look forward to our next conversation.
Okay, excellent. Have a good day.
You too, bro. I just think you're thick as a brick.